When most people hear the word masquerade, they think of costumes, fabric, entertainment, something decorative. But in many African societies, a masquerade was never a costume. It was a status change. When the mask came down, a human being disappeared, and something else stepped forward. Not metaphorically, socially, legally, spiritually. Tonight, we're talking about masquerades as they actually functioned across Africa, how they operated as systems of law and memory in places like Nigeria, and why colonial governments in the Americas felt threatened enough to ban them. Because this story is not about culture, it's about power. Across Africa, masquerades existed long before modern nation states, before police forces, before written law codes. They were part of governance, not symbolic governance, actual governance. Masquerades enforced moral law, resolved disputes, corrected antisocial behavior, mediated between the living and the dead, protected land, lineage, and memory. And here's the part often left out of textbooks. They did this publicly. No courtroom, no paperwork, no appeals. The appearance of a masquerade meant judgment had arrived.
Anthropological and historical records consistently describe African masquerades as ritual institutions tied to social regulation, ancestor veneration, and political authority. These systems predate colonial governance and functioned as legitimate mechanisms of law and order within their societies.
This wasn't isolated to one ethnic group or one region. Across West, Central, and parts of Southern Africa, masquerade systems appear with the same architecture. A masked figure is not treated as human. Its identity is erased. Its authority is absolute during ritual appearance. Among different peoples, the masquerade may represent an ancestor, a spirit of the land, a collective lineage, or a moral force larger than any individual. What changes is the costume. What stays the same is the function.
So basically, Africa said, we don't need cops. The ancestors will handle it. And everybody agreed.
Secrecy wasn't about exclusion. It was about containment of power. If everyone could access the masquerade role, its authority would collapse. If the human beneath was known, the illusion would break. If the rules were casual, the system wouldn't work. That's why unmasking was forbidden. Names were not spoken. Touching could be dangerous. Certain groups had restricted access depending on tradition. This wasn't superstition. It was institutional design.
Colonial administrators frequently described masquerade societies as secret or dangerous because they operated outside European legal frameworks and could not be easily controlled or surveilled.
Now here's where history turns. When Europeans encountered African masquerades, they didn't see culture. They saw a competing authority, a system that commanded obedience, mobilized communities, punished wrongdoing, operated without colonial approval. That made masquerades a problem, not spiritually, politically.
Of course they called it pagan. That's what you call something when you can't control it.
And this is where the story crosses the ocean. When Africans were taken into the Americas through enslavement, colonial governments did something very specific. They didn't just ban African religion. They banned masks, drums, nighttime gatherings, collective ritual movement, because they understood something critical. If Africans retained their masquerade systems, they retained governance.
Slave codes across the Americas explicitly restricted African gatherings, masking, and drumming. These prohibitions were legal attempts to dismantle African systems of collective authority and communication.
But here's the mistake they made. You can outlaw a mask. You can confiscate a drum. You can criminalize a gathering. What you cannot erase is a system that lives in the body. And in the next act, we'll see exactly how masquerades didn't disappear in the Americas. They translated. To understand how masquerades survived the Atlantic, we have to understand how powerful they were before the crossing. Nigeria is one of the clearest places to see this, because masquerades there were not symbolic reminders of order, they were the order. Among the Igbo and the Yoruba, masquerades did not sit on the edges of society. They stood at the center of law, morality, and ancestral continuity. And colonial governments noticed. In Igbo cosmology, reality is layered. The living are not separate from the dead. The dead are not gone. They are watching, advising, correcting. Masquerades known broadly as mmanwu are understood as the dead returning temporarily to the community, not metaphorically, functionally. When a mmanwu appears, the human wearer ceases to exist socially. The masquerade is treated as a spirit being. Its authority overrides individual status. This is why names are not spoken, why unmasking is forbidden, why disrespect carries consequences.
Historical and ethnographic records describe Igbo masquerades as embodiments of ancestral spirits who intervene in community affairs. Their authority derives from cosmology rather than individual identity, making them effective instruments of social regulation.
Not all Igbo masquerades do the same work. There are satirical masquerades that publicly mock greed, hypocrisy, or moral failure. Judicial masquerades that punish wrongdoing. Sacred masquerades that must not be approached at all. Some speak, some chase, some remain silent and terrifying. Fear was not accidental. Fear was educational. A child learned limits without explanation. An adult corrected behavior without argument. This is governance without paperwork.
So, basically, you didn't argue with a masquerade. You adjusted your life.
Nowhere is Igbo masquerade authority clearer than in Ijele. Ijele is not just another masquerade. It is the culmination of masquerade hierarchy. Towering, massive, structurally complex. It requires extensive preparation, community-wide cooperation, ritual sequencing. Ijele does not appear casually. It appears when something significant is being addressed. A major festival, a transition, a moment of collective reckoning.
Ijele has been formally recognized as an element of living cultural heritage, highlighting its role as a complex ritual institution rather than performance art.
Yoruba masquerade systems operate differently, but with equal gravity. Where Igbo masquerades often embody specific ancestral forces, Yoruba Egungun represent collective lineage ancestors. Not one spirit, many generations. The layered cloth of Egungun is not decoration, it is genealogy made visible. Each layer represents continuity, accumulation, ancestral presence. Movement matters, spinning matters, sound matters. The ancestors are believed to arrive through motion.
So, when Egungun spins, that's not flair, that's activation.
Exactly. Egungun appear to bless descendants, warn communities, correct imbalance, reinforce lineage responsibility. These are public appearances, witnessed, collective, which is why colonial officials found them threatening. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, British colonial administrators in Nigeria began documenting masquerades not as religion, but as problems. Why? Because masquerades commanded obedience without colonial approval, enforced justice outside British courts, mobilized communities rapidly, preserved non-European authority structures. Colonial reports routinely described masquerade societies as disruptive, dangerous, secretive, but secrecy wasn't the issue, autonomy was.
Colonial governance relied on dismantling indigenous authority systems. Masquerade institutions, which functioned as parallel legal and moral frameworks, conflicted directly with colonial administrative control.
So, when Africans were taken across the Atlantic, the colonizers already knew something crucial. Masquerades were not just spiritual, they were organizational infrastructure. Which is why in the Americas, laws did not merely ban African religion, they banned masks, drums, nighttime assemblies, collective movement, because masquerades had already proven what they could do. In Nigeria, masquerades governed life openly. In the Americas, they would have to survive in disguise. And in the next act, we follow that transformation from ancestral authority to coded resistance to survival masked as celebration. When Africans were taken into the Americas, masquerades did not disappear because people forgot them. They disappeared because they were made illegal. Colonial governments across the Caribbean and North America understood something essential. You cannot enslave people who retain their own systems of law, communication, and ancestral authority. So the mask had to go, the drum had to go, the gathering had to go, not because they were religious, because they were dangerous. Across the Americas, colonial authorities passed laws that targeted African ritual behavior with surgical precision. These laws did not say no masquerades. They said no masked gatherings, no nighttime assemblies, no drums or horns, no unsupervised movement, no heathen dances, which is another way of saying no African governance. In places like the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South, enslaved Africans were legally punished for wearing masks, dancing in groups, performing ancestral rituals, gathering after dark. The masquerade was identified early as a threat.
Slave codes throughout the Atlantic world demonstrate a consistent pattern. African ritual practices were criminalized because they facilitated communication, organization, and collective identity among enslaved populations.
From a colonial perspective, masquerades were terrifying for 3 reasons. First, anonymity. A masked figure cannot be easily identified, punished, or controlled. Second, collective movement. Masquerades gather people without written permission. Third, symbolic authority. When people obey something other than colonial law, the system weakens. Masquerades had already proven in Africa that they could enforce discipline, organize labor, mobilize communities, correct injustice. Colonial governments weren't guessing, they were reacting.
Basically, they weren't scared of spirits. They were scared of coordination.
Here's where African brilliance shows up. When something is illegal, you don't always fight it head on. Sometimes you change form. Masquerades adapted in 3 major ways in the Americas. Adaptation 1, from ritual to festival. Sacred appearances became holidays. Ancestor visitations became parades. Judgment became satire. What looked like entertainment was often coded survival. The structure stayed: procession, masking or disguise, rhythm, call and response, inversion of social roles. The meaning went underground. Adaptation 2. Masks became paint, cloth, feathers. Where full masks were banned, Africans used face paint, head wraps, feathers, layered clothing, exaggerated movement. The body became the mask. You could outlaw an object. You couldn't outlaw motion. Adaptation 3. Authority became satire. In Africa, masquerades judged openly. In the Americas, judgment came through mockery, exaggerated characters, trickster figures, public humor. Satire is safe judgment. Laughter disarms surveillance. This is where masquerades learned to smile.
That's not selling out. That's staying alive.
Across the Americas, masquerade DNA reappears under different names. Not identical, translated. Caribbean, Junkanoo, Junkanoo. In the Caribbean, masked processions like Junkanoo and Junkanoo preserve masking, drumming, ancestral movement, role inversion. These traditions emerged directly from African memory under enslavement. They were tolerated as celebration because their deeper structure was not fully understood. Brazil, Carnival as containment. In Brazil, African masquerade logic merged with Catholic calendars. Carnival became a pressure release, ritualized inversion, temporary freedom, controlled excess. Still African at its core, still regulated. United States, masking without masks. In North America, especially the US South, masquerades survived without obvious masks. They lived in Congo Square gatherings, ring shouts, spiritual dances, later, black masking traditions, most famously in New Orleans.
People call it costume, but the rules are strict. The lineage matters. The mask is earned. That's not play.
Let's be honest. Something was lost. The masquerade in the Americas no longer had full legal authority, the power to punish, the ability to openly govern. But something else survived. Memory, embodiment, collective rhythm, the right to become something other than what the system assigned you. Masquerades no longer judged the village. They reminded people who they were.
Cultural systems under repression often preserve core identity functions while shedding overt authority. Masquerades in the Americas demonstrate this adaptive preservation.
By the time masquerades reached the Americas, they were no longer allowed to rule. So they learned to teach. In the final acts, we're bringing this story into the present. What masquerades look like today in Africa, what they look like today in Nigeria, and what they still mean in the Americas even now. When people ask, do masquerades still exist? What they're really asking is something else. They're asking, did the ancestors survive modernity? And the answer is not simple, because today, masquerades exist in layers. Some are still sacred, some are ceremonial, some are performative, some are commercial. And confusing those layers is where misunderstandings begin. Across Africa today, masquerades were never revived. They never disappeared, but their visibility changed. In many regions, masquerades now exist in two parallel forms. One, ritual masquerades, still governed by elders, secrecy, and strict protocol. Two, public-facing masquerades, permitted for festivals, education, or heritage preservation. The same culture can hold both, but they are not interchangeable.
Contemporary African states often recognize masquerades as cultural heritage, while allowing traditional authorities to retain control over ritual forms. This dual structure preserves continuity while managing public access.
In many communities, certain masquerades still cannot be photographed, still restrict proximity, still operate on specific ritual calendars, still enforce behavioral norms. Their authority may no longer override national law, but it still overrides community behavior. People adjust their actions, they mind their speech, they teach children respect, not out of fear alone, out of memory.
So when people say, it's just culture now, what they really mean is, they're only seeing the part they're allowed to see.
In Nigeria, this layered reality is especially clear. Igbo communities today, among the Igbo, mmanwu still appear during specific festivals and rites. Sacred masquerades remain restricted. Public masquerades often serve educational or celebratory roles. The line between sacred and public is known locally, even when outsiders can't see it. A masquerade can look playful and still carry ancestral weight. Yoruba communities today. Among the Yoruba, Egungun ceremonies continue as lineage-based rituals. Families and communities maintain strict protocols. Public Egungun festivals coexist with restricted ancestral rites. Movement, cloth, and music still matter, not as symbolism, as activation.
Modernization did not erase masquerade systems. It repositioned them. Ritual authority persists alongside state governance, particularly at the community level.
In the Americas, masquerades live differently. They no longer govern communities, but they still remember. Today, masquerade-derived traditions appear as Carnival masking, Junkanoo and Junkanoo, Black masking traditions, ritualized parades and competitions. What's missing is formal authority. What remains is identity, lineage pride, embodiment, resistance through form. The masquerade no longer judges, it testifies.
So, in Africa, the masquerade says, behave. In the Americas, it says, remember. Different job, same soul.
Here's the danger in the modern moment. When everything is called masquerade, nothing is understood correctly. Sacred rituals get treated like costumes. Cultural displays get mistaken for spiritual authority. Tourism blurs boundaries that were once clear. And when boundaries disappear, meaning erodes. Not everything masked is ancestral. Not everything ancestral is public. That distinction matters.
Cultural misinterpretation often occurs when ritual systems are detached from their governing structures. Understanding context is essential to preservation.
Masquerades today are not fossils. They are living systems that learned how to survive empire, law, religion, and time. In Africa, they still walk with authority. In Nigeria, they still carry ancestral law. In the Americas, they still move memory through the body. And in the final act, we're answering the last question. What does all of this mean now? For identity, for culture, for people trying to remember who they are. By now, it should be clear. Masquerades were never about costumes. They were never just festivals. They were never superstition. They were systems that answered a question every society must answer. Who has the authority to shape behavior, memory, and meaning? And once you understand that, you can no longer look at masking traditions the same way again. Masquerades protected three things above all else. First, continuity. They ensured the dead were not erased by time. Second, community regulation. They corrected behavior without prisons or paperwork. Third, identity stability. They reminded people who they were accountable to, not the state, not money, not power, but lineage, land, memory. When colonial systems attacked masquerades, they weren't attacking art. They were attacking independent identity systems.
When indigenous systems of meaning persist across centuries of disruption, it indicates resilience at the level of identity architecture, not mere tradition.
Masquerades still unsettle people today, not because of fear, but because they challenge a modern assumption that identity is individual, that authority is centralized, that memory is optional. Masquerades say something else entirely. They say, you are not alone, you are not self-made, you are not disconnected. And modern systems struggle with that message.
Because if your ancestors still have a voice, then not everything belongs to the present, and not everyone gets to decide the rules.
Here's where this becomes personal. Modern psychology talks about dissociation, identity fragmentation, inherited trauma, collective memory. African masquerade systems already address these realities. They gave communities structured role switching, controlled identity shifts, ritualized embodiment, collective witnessing. The masquerade allowed people to become something else temporarily without losing themselves permanently. That's not primitive. That's sophisticated.
Contemporary neuroscience increasingly recognizes the role of embodied ritual in regulating identity, memory, and emotional integration.
In the diaspora, masquerades no longer govern law, but they still govern belonging. They show up when people mask themselves to tell the truth, dance to remember something they were never taught, gathering rhythm without knowing why, feel drawn to ritual without language for it. That's not coincidence, that's inheritance.
You don't need the whole system for the signal to keep traveling. Sometimes the body carries the message long after the rules are gone.
So what does responsibility look like now? It doesn't mean romanticizing everything old. It doesn't mean copying rituals you don't belong to. It doesn't mean turning sacred systems into aesthetics. It means discernment, knowing what is sacred, what is ceremonial, what is public, what is not yours to touch. Respect is not silence, it's accuracy.
Cultural continuity depends on informed engagement rather than replication without context.
Masquerades survived enslavement, colonial law, religious suppression, and modernity, not by refusing to change, but by refusing to disappear. They walked when they could, they hid when they had to, they taught instead of ruled. And today, they still ask the same question they always have. Do you remember who you answer to? The mask still walks, not because the past won, but because memory adapted. And if you feel something stir when you see it, that's not fear, that's recognition.